Well, Labour has traditionally and quite understandably been sensitive about putting up taxes because that's the principal allegation against them, always made by the Conservative Party and their friends in the media. And they have a lot of friends in the media. They can make life very difficult.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to The Focus, our final episode for 2025. What a year it's been for Britain. A new government, a precarious economy, ongoing crises in Europe, and a political landscape that feels like it's shifting beneath our feet. Tonight, I'm joined by three voices who can cut through the fog. Returning guest, former British Labour MP and author Chris Mullin. First-timer on The Focus, Royal Navy veteran and former British intelligence specialist Commodore Tyrrell, who'll be joining us in about 15 odd minutes. And another first-timer on The Focus, investigative journalist Pete Warren. We're going to tackle the big questions. Britain's budget, due to be released tomorrow on the 26th of November, the government's foreign policy direction, Ukraine, the state of UK defence, Russian provocations, and of course, Keir Starmer's political durability in the face of Nigel Farage's Reform Party insurgency. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here. Let's start with the budget. Britain has sluggish growth, high debt servicing costs, and claims from the Treasury that the country has no money left for major strategic projects. Chris, you've watched governments navigate crises for decades. With sluggish growth and a budgetary hole of 20 to 40 billion pounds, I believe, is the 2025 budget a necessary correction or a failure of political courage? And if the panacea is increased taxes and revenue raising, what happens to London's rich? Will they just move to the fairer climes of Milan and Dubai?
Well, it is a failure of political judgment because before the previous government left office, they set a trap for the Labour Party, which was then in opposition. Jeremy Hunt, the then Chancellor, in January 2024, cut national insurance by 2%, and then in April 2024, cut it by another 1%, thereby costing the Treasury billions. And then he challenged Labour to say, well, would you put it up if you were elected? And instead of giving the obvious reply, we'll make up our minds if and when we get there. And by the way, the next election won't be about tax cuts. It'll be about the dire state of the public sector. The then Chancellor and Mr. Starmer said, no, we won't put up any of the three main sources of tax revenue, and thereby fell into this giant trap that had been prepared for them. It was clearly labelled a trap. This is a trap, Rachel Reeves, please note. But she didn't. They could have done anything they wanted in the first, with a majority of 170 something, in the first months after they were elected, but they didn't. And a year on, they now find that they have to do something. And they're in a bit of a trap because of these three pledges they made. And it sounds like, I mean, we'll find out later today, it sounds like she's going to stick with them, in which case she'll be looking to raise money from all sorts of sources, and all sorts of interest groups will be popping up saying how catastrophic this is for whatever interest they represent. So there's no good way out of this that I can see. So yes, it's a massive political misjudgment, in my view, that will haunt them probably for their whole term of office.
So, what accounts for the political timidity of people in power these days? I mean, we have them here in Australia, of course. So, Britain's not, as we would say, a shag on the rock. But, what accounts, do you think, for the lack of foresight and the lack of strength of leadership?
Well, Labour has traditionally and quite understandably been sensitive about putting up taxes because that's the principal allegation against them, always made by the Conservative Party and their friends in the media. And they have a lot of friends in the media. They can make life very difficult. There's an issue with the British public too, as well. I think both political parties have misled, both the main parties have led the public to believe that you can have North European standards of welfare and health treatment and all the rest of it for American levels of taxation. And the truth is you can't. And neither party leveled with them over that. The IFS, which is the most respected Institute for Fiscal Studies, the most respected think tank, says both parties were in complete denial at the election, despite the fact that organisations like the IFS had pointed out that they were going to need to raise taxation. If the Tories had won the last election, they'd have had to put back up the cut taxes that they'd cut or something similar. And they would have done. I mean, they're entirely cynical, but be under no illusion about that. And then there's some added pressures, of course, and the big one is defence spending in the light of Ukraine. If you really want to spend a lot more money on defence, then that has to come out of taxation, and there ain't any way around it. And that's probably the only increase in public spending that the Tory party will go for. Though even then, although they love spending money on defence, even then it would have to come out of taxation. And so I can't. That would have been in addition to any the problems they left us with failing public services.
Pete, you follow data corruption, procurement, tech waste. Is Britain broke or just badly mismanaged?
I think, I mean, going to some of the things that Chris has been saying, there's tremendous indecision that's going on at the moment. I think one of the reasons for such indecision is because political parties have become extremely sensitive to things like social media. So when you've got that indecision that occurs, and we didn't have social media before, it's become a real distraction, but it also, while it's a distraction, it's still something that as a politician, it must absolutely terrify you. So in terms of it being badly managed, I mean, I've been looking at this for a long time, just from the technological point of view, just because it strikes me that the only way out of the malaise that we're in at the moment is if we can start to develop a high-tech economy. If you look at Silicon Valley, if you look at America, and if you look at India and China, that's what they're doing. Here in the UK, since the time of Thatcher, possibly a little earlier, we had this idea within the civil service of laissez-faire. If science works, it's going to work. We shouldn't really back particular technologies or technology initiatives because we might back the wrong horse. So what we'll do is we'll wait and see if something emerges, and then we'll put our money behind it. Well, we haven't done that. I'll give you a really good example. I was and this actually goes to something that Chris was saying. I was utterly inadvertently in some of the meetings to do with the new chip initiative to develop a new silicon chip industry in the UK. They invited me by mistake, and it was very much like the Peter Hegseth social media conversation where a journalist was in who shouldn't have been there, and I was sitting in this thing wondering, what on earth am I doing in here? And people were talking about, hey, we need to develop this new chip industry. We've got £1 billion. £1 billion is not very much if you're going to develop a new computer chip industry. And the interesting thing there, which is perhaps the only glimmer of hope, was they were saying, well, what is the market that we're going to aim for? Well, the market that we should aim for is the defense market. That's one of the few places we can start developing these chips, begin to actually find a way through, and we can possibly branch out from there. So Chris's comment about the fact that we're suddenly spending a bit more on defense, perhaps that could be a way of actually kickstarting an economy that we desperately need. I mean, it's risible if you actually look at. Perhaps the sad thing was that Sir Tim Berners-Lee didn't patent the internet. If he had, we could have had a sovereign wealth fund beyond compare. But if you actually look at some of the technologies that we actually span out in the wake of the internet, it's nothing in comparison to what the Americans did. Yeah, I think that given the fact that we developed mobile phone chips at Martlesham Heath, not a million miles away from where I am at the moment, given that we've developed so many different technologies and our inability to actually come through on those, it's actually, I find it, what's the word? Disappointing, I think is probably the English way of saying it.
To both
Ca- ca-
you and to Chris, if you don't mind, about neoliberal economics. I mean, how much of that do you blame for the acceleration of short-termism? You know, there are no governments on either side that I can see that really can see beyond the electoral cycle. And I think it's pushed along by the fact that, you know, the people who are supporting the various political parties are all in, you know, for a short period of time. They want to see what their results are for the money that they get. And, you know, they have this devil may care attitude with regard to, not looking beyond the electoral cycle. Whereas the British people as a whole need to see beyond the electoral cycle. They want good governance. Where has that gone? If I go back to Chris and then Peter, if you can jump in then.
Well, the electorate is slightly an issue here as well. It's not for a politician to complain too much about the electorate, but they all want lots of good things. Any poll will tell you that, but they don't want to pay for them because they're against all the different ways of raising the resources. I thought Peter's point about social media is quite right. That has made politics much more febrile. So I heard someone on the radio the other day say, a political journalist, say that the present generation of political journalists have turned politics into a game of gotcha. It's who can you bring down, usually on some short-term pretext, some minor, sometimes major, but often minor issues. I give you one recent example. The present Chancellor of the Exchequer, who lives in number 11 Downing Street, had rented out her home while she's in Downing Street. And her husband had handled the transaction. And he hadn't known that in some boroughs, including the one she lived in, you had to have a license in order to be able to rent out a home. Well, I say he hadn't known. I think actually the estate agent they were dealing with said they would deal with it and then didn't. And the estate agent concerned owned up to that. But mass hysteria was organised over that. And of course, opposition parties latch on to it. We got used, especially, we've had, is it 5 or 6 prime ministers since 2015? And we've kind of got used to the fact that prime ministers only last a year or two. And the present generation of political journalists have grown up with that and they see it as their job. And it does actually mean that you don't have to address any long-term issues. It's easy politics. I'll give you another classic example. Well, whenever the prime minister goes abroad to the G20 summit or for talks with President Trump or to the United Nations, the Westminster journalists travel on the plane with him. This has been an issue for some years. I can remember it when the Blair government was in. And they are not interested in what the purpose of the visit is. They're pursuing whatever little scandal or in some cases fabricated scandals that happen to be the issue of the day back home. So you start, the Prime Minister, I remember Barack Obama expressed amazement that they followed the Prime Minister of the day, Gordon Brown, into the Oval Office and was still asking him about what must to anybody in the outside world seem trivial issues. It happened the other day. Keir Starmer was in South Africa for the G20 meeting. And I saw, I think, the BBC's main political correspondent questioning him about Prince Andrew's difficulties. And God knows we've had enough of that over recent years. Now, why would you travel all that way personally? If I was Prime Minister, which by some inexplicable oversight I'm not, I wouldn't take them with me. I wouldn't. They've got correspondents in Washington and South Africa and so forth. I would get them to report the issue, the purpose of the visit. They can keep up this nonsense back home, but why should you take it abroad with you? I just do not understand. But it does undermine the way politics is conducted, and it leads to terrible short-termism. And social media has a lot to do with that. You're looking for a little clip you can get up on social media and make the whoever's in authority at the time look ridiculous or evil. And it's destroying any sort of long-term thinking.
Pete, how do we get on top of the social media bubble in politics? Is there a cure for this, or is it something we just have to sit back and take on the chin?
I think we basically just need to get used to it. One of the things that people really don't get about social media is as Chris says, it's generating this very febrile atmosphere, but there's nothing new happening. There's a lot of the conversations about this within technology said, oh, there's going to be so many more messages. There's going to be machines are going to be sending messages to each other, and there's this huge volume of information. But well, oddly, we're not actually generating that many more stories. The events are still the same. People are not, there's still a static amount of people. So what we do is the noise. Yeah, you get a massive increase in noise. I mean, this is like a starling flock to the power of 100. So unfortunately, what we have to do is suddenly just say, I mean, you see all of these AI systems that will filter out the noise. What we just got to say is, hang on, there's nothing actually happening. If you look at the BBC website or the Guardian website or the Telegraph website, and you look, the stories stay static. They stay actually as static as they used to in the days of newspapers. It's just you've got these endless amount of people speculating. Look at all of the speculation that we've had about the UK budget, the leaks that we've had that have gone on and on and on. You never used to get that in the past. So you've got lots of people just coming up with meaningless noise, and it really is quite meaningless. The amount of speculation. I mean, you look at the amount of websites there are in the US which are endlessly speculating about how somebody's picked their nose. It's absolutely silly. So what we've got to do is actually suddenly start to just think, hang on, this is too much noise. What is important? Yeah, and also I need to get on with my life. I wanted to go to something that Chris had said about picking people up when they're abroad. Well, Chris, I'm sorry, that goes with the territory. I did it to Douglas Hurd in Kuwait City, and I also did it to Senator Chuck Robb, who would have been president rather than Clinton in a refugee camp in Safwan. The reason I actually came about was just funny because the Washington Post correspondent was a friend of Chuck Robb's family. He didn't want to ask this question about did Chuck Robb accept a torso massage from Miss America. And so he asked me if I would do it. And so I said, I was thinking, it's a bit of a shitty, sorry, excuse me, a bit of a low blow, but I'll ask. And I mean, he looked as though he'd been poleaxed. I felt very guilty about the whole thing. But it's you take your chance, Chris. I'm sorry.
My point would be these correspondents have plenty of chances back home. And indeed, they've been on about the same issues back home continuously. And that when you go to South Africa to talk about the fate of the world economy, or to Brazil to talk about the rainforest or the destruction of the rainforest, perhaps we ought to have somebody local reporting it who has an interest in those matters rather than this lot who are flowing in for 24
I completely
hours.
agree with you. However, Donald Trump is currently was complaining about people bringing up Epstein when he wanted to talk about the remarkable things that he'd apparently done with the American economy. So it's a par for the course, I'm afraid. Yeah, and look, I do think that in terms of social media, it is silly, but and I do think that at some point social media, we will get used to social media, and I think that we will probably start to junk quite a lot of it. I'm as guilty as anybody on this. I endlessly feed stuff into LinkedIn because it gives me an opportunity to sound off. And I used to have a reputation for becoming quite splenetic about particular things at certain points. And it lets me do it. I think I was looking appreciably at my impression rate, and I think I was up to 25,000 yesterday, where and I'd been saying the most stupid things. But anyway, it's attention. We all crave attention, don't we,
Well,
Pat?
anyway, Pat has just joined us. Pat, thanks for coming in. And we were just talking about the budget and social media and all that kind of stuff. So now that you've joined us, can I ask you, we've got the British budget coming out tomorrow. From a defense perspective and a national security perspective, what do you think this budget will mean for the UK? Are we looking at a self-inflicted vulnerability here?
Well, if you're asking whether I think this budget is going to fix anything that really needs fixing, the answer is no. I think this budget has been analysed, dissected, put out to focus groups so much that I suspect there's very little that will be new, and certainly nothing that will be innovative or radical in it. I think that the current government has got a very major financial problem. On the one hand, it makes all sorts of claims, including on the defence side, the need to move to, from 2.5% to 3%, and then ultimately upwards to 5%. And it makes those claims, but it's got no money. We're back to, I think it was Theresa May's magic money tree. There is no such thing. The big problem has been that we are suffering from a lack of economic growth. And despite what successive governments have tried ineffectually over the last 15 years, nothing has been done. So I do not expect the budget to in any way answer any of the defence issues. It is merely building up more debt on the welfare side. They've sort of corralled themselves in a position they can't get out of in terms of, manifesto commitments and income tax raises and whatever. And it's going to be a real sort of pool of vomit on the floor of the House of Commons tomorrow.
That's a very florid way of putting it.
could I just put a point to Pat, please?
Yes.
About defence spending. One of the difficulties with defence is that the military, all branches of them, want more of everything, and they will not choose between the various major options. The other point is that the Ministry of Defence is horrendously bad at spending the defence money. They waste on an extraordinary scale. I mean, you'll be aware of the Ajax tanks and various other things over the years. These are billions frittered away on weapons that don't work or are outdated. They really have got to get their act together, haven't they, if they want significant increases in defence spending?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that the problem is that they always want the shiny new kit, the biggest. I mean, not quite. We're not with Hegseth yet, or Trump demanding battleships back again. But they want the biggest aircraft carriers, or they want the biggest tanks, or they want the biggest manned fighter aircraft. And we have a system that is inherently designed to make for bad procurement. So if I as a commander, become the project manager for whatever it is, I know that my future career, and I'm looking for promotion in 2 years' time, my future career depends upon my name being noticed. Not on me delivering a successful outcome, because that's 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the pike. It needs me to be noticed. So at least, the promotion board can say, Tyrrell, I've heard of Tyrrell, in which case he must be a good egg, we'll promote him. And therefore, the way to do this is to make a big fuss about the piece of kit you're responsible for and say, well, actually, things have changed since it was originally designed. We need to put this in and that in and take this out. And of course, the defence companies love that, because suddenly they can tear up their original contract, which stipulates exactly what it's going to be. And they can say, well, yeah, of course you can. Yes, you want this? Don't worry. And they put in all sorts of contingencies into the cost. Now, you can then say, well, don't let people do this. But on the other hand, if you look at drone technology, if I'm talking to the Treasury about a program and I say, I want to spend so much over the next 5 years on drone technology, they will say to me, what is your drone going to look like? And I'll go, I haven't got a clue. You know, it will be an evolution from what we've got now. Or it might be a revolution because somebody has a really good idea and needs a bit of innovative kit. And we need to get some clever people. I would get rid of most of the inmates of the Ministry of Defence, because they just do what they've always done because they've never got into trouble doing it. And let's have some. Yes, Peter.
The problem with this, Pat, is you look at what's happening in Ukraine, you look at the drones that have been developed there. I mean, these aren't just innovative. These are things that are strung together with a couple of elastic bands, a battery, and they actually end up looking like that phone that you used to carry around forever, that Nokia brick that you had. And that's the problem with all of this. If the MOD get a hold of it, they want to design it so that it looks like a sort of super effective drone. It looks as though, and it's got the bells and whistles on it as well, and it's going to be adopted for all of these contingencies. What the Ukrainians have actually pulled off with their drones is quite incredible, and it's also emblematic of the way that warfare is going to go. I don't personally think that people have actually got much more of a role in warfare. I mean, and when you talk about Hegseth and battleships, it reminds me of, if you go back into medieval times, you had these people who were in their suits of armor on these great big chargers, and they were pretty useless. I mean, if they ran into 20 infantrymen, they'd pull them off the horse and stab a knife through the visor of the thing. They might have looked good when they were all charging at each other, but in real war, they're not going to be much use. Aircraft carriers, they're very high out of the water. The Americans developed an aircraft carrier that is, I think it's only about a meter above the water, and it fires drones out of it. That's the future. That's where we should be going, surely. Unfortunately, all of those people who have their lives vested in being part of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, they're unfortunately going to have to find something else to do. Cyber warfare is the way forward. So are directed energy weapons.
There are just a couple of things that I'd like to pick up on. Firstly, today the defense dollar doesn't stretch like it used to because yes, we have all these gold-plated, highly technical pieces of kit that we all covet, which is one very real problem with defense industry today. But, we can only afford a handful of them. I mean, look at the Royal Navy and look at how many Joint Strike Fighters they can afford to place on the two aircraft carriers that the Royal Navy has. I think that they've got basically a quarter of a complement each, and they were meant to have like a full complement of JSF on both aircraft carriers, so they had a power projection capability. I mean, costs manifest themselves in a whole bunch of ways, but one of those ways is, of course, that if we keep on buying into a system that is ripping us off effectively, and we buy into it and we create organizations to support it, and we come up with excuses why we have to have the best for our boys and girls, and this is the best, and it's all crap, but it's crap that sells and it makes people's careers.
I think because you have an industry founded on it. The F-35 costs 85 million pounds. And it's also got a fighter on it, a fighter pilot on it, who's extremely expensive to train. If you actually look at one of the UK destroyers has a technology on it, which is a laser beam. It costs £10 to fire the laser.
It's called Dragonfire. It will be fully operational in 2 years' time. And actually, it's a good piece of innovative design. But normally that wouldn't get through the single services and the procurement authority or the treasury, because actually they didn't know what it was going to look like when it finished. But it was designed, as you say, Peter, it's $10 a shot, which is considerably cheaper than firing $1 million missile at a drone. And there are groups of people, and And at one point, the American military, and we're not talking about the American military at the moment, but the American military had a very innovative setup for encouraging innovation and being able to test innovative products. And they would encourage small, tiny startup companies that had bright ideas, the sort of nerds who are dealing with cyber, or the people who are dealing with drones, or the people who are, just dealing with lasers for the hell of it, and say, what do you think we ought to be doing? And would fund it. We don't like doing that. And of course, because we don't like doing it, when they come along with a costed thing, we almost invariably say, well, no, we don't need that. It's not made by BAE, or it's, not made by Lockheed Martin. And we always go to the big companies, because the big companies always rip us off. Oh, sorry, no, the big I mean, it's ridiculous. Yeah. So I agree with all the points that have been made. And does that mean that defence is in a complete mess? Yes, it is. Somebody needs to take charge of this.
Yes. Well, that's probably a podcast that can stand on its own, which we will attack next year. But anyway, gentlemen, let's shift from the budget to what it says about Britain's place in the world. Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper says Britain will pursue global security, migration, climate, growth and development, becoming a proactive partner for progress and peace abroad, because security and prosperity at home depends on that. Well, I don't know. That sounds pretty expensive to me. And I'm sure her critics hear something else in all of that: managed decline. Chris, what do you think is the animating principle of Starmer's foreign policy?
Well, I think Labour is a more globalist party than the other one. And we do take an interest in climate change and what needs to be done about it. Whether or not we have the solutions is another matter. Whether or not anybody has the solutions is another matter. We did, until a year or two ago, take quite an interest in the welfare of the countries around the periphery of Europe. There was a good bit of self-interest in that, though I don't think we ever sold it in this way, that one of the reasons why illegal migration, which is driving politics across Europe to the right, is such a big issue is because the countries around the periphery of Fortress Europe are disintegrating. You can list them. It would help if we didn't invade them from time to time. I suppose the one thing we have learned over the years is that when you take the lid off one of these tyrannies, Libya, Iraq, Syria, you unleash the fires of hell. But much more than that, you've now got this Sudan disintegrating. And it did pay to invest in development aid in these countries to turn them into, if not functioning market economies, at least more or less functioning governments. One of the things we used to do, which I thought was very cost effective, was to send people from the inland revenue to some of these countries that were rich but weren't raising any money in tax, and teach them how to set up a proper system of taxation. And when they could do that, the government would then have some money, which it could choose, if it chose, to spend on its citizens. And we did that in Angola and Mozambique, and I think with some success, revenues increased greatly. That's a relatively small, easy thing to do that does make a difference. But it is in our interests, to have functioning economies around the periphery of Europe. And if we have collapsed states, failed states, which we do all too often, not only because of civil wars, but sometimes because of climate change, the desert that is advancing into Nigeria, for example. There are going to be 400 million people in Nigeria, 180 million at the moment, by the end of this century, apparently. Well, it's greatly in our interest that these countries have more or less stable governments. It's not just for us, it's true for all of Europe, actually. All the developed countries have to take an interest in this, because it is linked to the big increase and growing increase in illegal migration. Now, here's one of the ironies, that the people most against development aid are also those who feel strongest about illegal migration. And therefore, it's very difficult to have a rational conversation on the subject.
Pete, the UK talks tough on China, and London insists that the UK remains central to European security. But is the rhetoric matched by capability? And here I'm really thinking about cyber, AI, the stuff that you're really interested in.
Do you know, one of the most optimistic things that I have seen in 30 years occurred about a week and a half ago, which was the really boringly named Cyber Resilience Bill. For 30 years, we've been waiting for something that has actually got some stick in it. And, the fact that the people in the supply chain are being told that that 10% of their profits could be a day, could go if they don't actually implement decent cybersecurity measures, and that we should have breach disclosure. I had a row with Emma Nicholson in 1990 when I said that we needed mandatory breach disclosure. She told me at the time I was stupid. So, which obviously I am. It's pretty obvious that you've got to have mandatory breach disclosure if you want to know what the threat is that you're facing. Oh, is the UK doing enough? Now that maybe we could begin to get a bit of a handle on it, perhaps, you're looking at one of the people who actually started some of the thinking on this, and that's Commodore Tyrrell. He was the one who started saying that we should do things like have borders in cyberspace. And I think he was probably rubbished at the time. Obviously, you've got two Cassandras on your panel. You can have borders in cyberspace. I've been speaking to so many companies in the last year or so who are saying that you can actually start to introduce sovereignty in cyberspace because you have to, because of GDPR. So are things changing? They are changing. They should have changed faster. The one thing that happens with cybersecurity is that a lot of people don't know what on earth they're talking about, to be perfectly honest. It's like so much in defence, there is, to use the politest term possible, there is ever such a lot of rubbish talked. And there are a lot of people selling a lot of fear, uncertainty and doubt to people who don't know what it is that they're doing. What should the government do? Well, the UK government and the Australian government and many governments across Europe should actually be putting something together to try to identify basic requirements that people should actually push out. They should, the insurance industry should also gather in that. But you've got to take on board too that this is an asymmetric threat. Where the people always do the unconventional. It's changing all of the time. Very much like modern warfare. One of the things we've been doing a lot of research into space at the moment, which has been just fascinating, just because of the potential for making stupid journalistic jokes about space. The House of Lords said 2 weeks ago that space represented this massive opportunity, and it does. And again, that's something that we need to embrace, because I didn't realize this until I went to a conference in Tallinn 3 weeks ago. The satellites are fighting each other. I mean, they can't actually fight each other, but apparently, because we're so rather sad as a nation, people march their satellites up to other ones and try and intimidate them like playground bullies, which just sounds to me as just pathetic. However, that's what the new issues are. So, yeah, cyberspace, we need to do more in cyberspace. We need to do much more in terms of deployment of AI, thinking about AI, and in terms of people talking about broke Britain. No, Chris was talking about climate change. Yeah, sub-Saharan Africa is going to lead to huge displacement of peoples. And where are they going to go? They're going to go north. They're not going to go to Antarctica because that would be silly. So what do? Well, there's all of this opportunity in these climate technologies. It's not net zero. It's not the loading things into making things more expensive. President Trump said, drill, baby, drill. Well, the Chinese, for the last 18 months, have actually not been making any net contributions to carbon. And the Chinese are very, very quietly getting on with developing green technology for climate change, because they know that that's going to be technology that they can sell in the future. It's obvious that's what you're going to do. I know that sounds a little rambling, but I was just trying to say there are technologies that we can work on that will be very, very good. We need to get to speed with the technologies of the 21st century. We need to detach ourselves from the thinking and the technologies of the 20th century. And we have to also develop, in my opinion, a new way of thinking where we're actually constructive to each other, which is why I brought up the example of the satellites trying to intimidate each other, because it just seems silly. And I know you're going to be probably talking about undersea cables, but again, what's going on with undersea cables strikes me as silly.
Pat, you've seen the evolution of British statecraft from the inside. Are we seeing a coherent strategy being developed here?
But I could be flippant and say I'm not sure there's been a coherent strategy come out of the Westminster government or many other governments for many, many years. I think that we have to understand that most people don't understand the implications of these sorts of things. The implications are such they don't fit in with normal politicians and policymakers' timelines. I mean, a politician, I'm sure Chris will disagree with me, but, politician timelines tend to be when's the next election coming up? And, how am I going to have to explain myself to my electorate? And many of these things, will not. I mean, the reason why it took so long for climate change to become important was that people wanted immediate events that they could react to, rather than saying, well, in 50 years' time, this is, the Sahara is going to be totally uninhabitable, and therefore people are going to migrate north, whether you like it or not. And you nations, the richer nations, have to work out what you're going to do in 10 years, 15 years, 25 years, not what are we going to do next year. And there's a sort of parable, really, which came out years ago when we were having the Kosovo conflict. I was at the time running a part of the British Ministry of Defence that dealt with what we called psychological warfare, which the government then heard it was called psychological warfare and said, oh, that sounds rather nasty. Can't we call it something else? So we'll call it thought processes. I mean, but we wanted to persuade the people who were supporting Milosevic that doing what he was doing was going to cause them real damage. And we had a psychological operation. It's a grand title, but basically what we did was we arranged for fighter bombers to go over and drop foil onto the electricity substations in Belgrade, which shut them all down. And it took them, 6 hours or 10 hours to, get back up again. And then the second phase of the operation was to send in the aircraft, dropping leaflets and putting out programs. We were going to take over the national programming, the sort of their equivalent of the BBC, and flood them with messages that say, okay, it was inconvenient this morning, wasn't it? It was a bit difficult when you woke up, you couldn't make your cup of coffee. If you don't do something about that quickly, we are actually going to bomb those sites, and then you won't have anything left to work with. And the point was to try to get the industrialists in particular to say, look, this is ridiculous. The powers that be in NATO decided this was a great wheeze. And so they allowed us to drop the foil, but then they decided let's shortcut the thing. We can't, it would be illegal, we were told by the Ministry of Defence lawyers, to go in and suborn the equivalent of Serbian BBC, because that would be against the International Broadcasting Act of whenever it was, and we couldn't possibly do that. Therefore, the best thing we could do was actually go and bomb the electrical distribution sites, which was okay. Bombed them. They couldn't make their coffee for several days. And of course, then when we went in to try to do recovery, we had to pay for vast quantities of heavy electrical machinery to go in to make up for the damage we'd caused. So, you went from something that had a longer term process but was worked on the brain to having something that had kinetic process. And I'm afraid to say that all my military colleagues enjoy kinetic process. It goes bang, it makes smoke, it destroys things. Everyone's happy. So until we learn that lesson, that we have to take longer over these processes, and we have to accept that things take time, we're never going to change people's minds.
Can I just come in on that? Because I think that Pat and Chris have both made this point, and I think it's an essential point. And it is that this longevity is the thing that we need to think about, because there is a terrible short-termism. There's a terrible short-termism in politics on a 4-year cycle. Some of the changes that we're talking about in a sense of, say, developing a technological strategy for get yourself out of decline. You have to say, right, that's the plan, and we're going to make that happen, and you have to stick to it. You look at, say, technological development. We had Silicon Glen in the UK, which I think was under Margaret Thatcher. We had the Silicon Corridor down the M5 from Reading to Swindon. We've had Gordon Brown and Tony Blair announce Silicon Fen, which just was incredibly amusing because, and now we have, we've got another Silicon Corridor, which is, it just shows, if you want your managed decline, it shows how much our ambitions have fallen, because it's just between Cambridge and Oxford now. So we've shortened it. It's HS2 for Silicon. We've got to stop some of this sort of sectionalism, and we've got to start being intelligent. Anyway, sorry, that's my outburst.
Well, gentlemen, foreign policy is pretty meaningless without credible defence, and that brings us to perhaps the most fraught part of our discussion. 2025 began with the British Army smaller than at any time since the Napoleonic era. The Royal Navy has world-class platforms, but not enough crew, and for that matter, not enough platforms. The Royal Air Force is overstretched, dependent on American F-35 Joint Strike Fighters, while giving up on the more affordable European-designed and built Typhoon. Pat, let's be blunt. Is Britain still a serious military power? Can its current and expected expenditures cope with supporting a wider international remit, such as AUKUS?
Well, I think AUKUS is a conversation to be had on its own. And you and I have discussed this before in terms of the breadth as well as the depth of resource that is required to make something like AUKUS happen. And I don't believe that breadth or depth is available in any of the three participants. I don't think that the United States has the ability to be able to produce the number of submarines it will have to produce, let alone, it doesn't have the industrial capacity, let alone the mental personnel capacity to be able to man those submarines and to be able to make sure that they are enter service reliably. Neither does the UK, and sure as eggs are eggs, Australia doesn't, although I note that you're making, great strides in training up some of the Australian engineers for the nuclear submarines. As an idea, as a concept, it's brilliant. Unfortunately, its brilliance comes at a huge cost. And I think that politicians and policymakers have slightly obfuscated the issues so that people are not really aware of the difficulties they are. They have not faced up to those difficulties, and they're certainly not putting up the amounts of cash that would needed to be put up to make it work. So let's just park AUKUS for a minute. Is the UK still a major military power in the world? I'd say the jury is out at the moment. I think that we are singularly ill-equipped in terms of men and resources. I don't necessarily think that the fact that the army is the smallest it's been since Napoleonic times is necessarily a disabler, because I think that, as Peter has amply shown over the last hour or so, actually we don't need lots of people. We need clever people who can do new things, and that we mustn't be looking at the Ukraine conflict has shown just how different a battlefield is today than it was 15 years ago. Now, that's not to say that many of the capabilities we had in previous battlefields is not going to be required, because it'll be horses for courses, depending upon where you are, who you're fighting, what the military objectives are. But I think that we have poor guidance from our senior military staff as to exactly how British forces or American forces or Australian forces are going to be used in future in conflict.
Chris, the Labour government promised to take defence seriously. Are they sleepwalking into strategic irrelevance?
Well, I think neither of the main parties have really come to grips with the fact that over the last 40, 50 years, we are actually, we're not a world power. And we've been in retreat, of course, since the 1960s. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think our future lies in alliances with preferably some of our European equivalents. Whether we should be making alliances to patrol the Pacific or to take on China if it should choose to attack Taiwan, I have my doubts about that. Well, as I say, what we need to be realistic, and so do our military. We are a middle income, middle-sized European power. We are not a global power, and we have been pretending for years that we are. I think we are. Reality has kicked in a bit in recent years, and that's not a bad thing.
So Chris, if many of the problems that we've been talking about up to now, and I mean, I can say from an Australian political perspective, we've got similar issues, but if it all comes back down to politics and the way policy is being guided, what can you tell our listeners about where Starmer is getting things right or where he's getting things wrong?
At the outset, I think I said that his big mistake was not to take decisive action on the economy and taxation immediately after being elected with a large majority, and as I say, that will haunt them. I think he's proved quite good at handling Trump, incidentally, who is that's one of the things I've heard. Even commentators who are hostile to him, as most of them are, compliment him about. I mean, it's very difficult. That wonderful state visit, you remember, that we
Oh, yes.
humiliatingly had to give those sort of mafiosos. But he never came into contact with any of the public or our elected representatives in his 36-hour state visit. He landed on the Long Walk in Windsor Great Park, which was sealed off to the public for the duration. He had a banquet and lots of soldiers marching up and down. They chose a time when Parliament was not sitting, so there was no question of the usual joint address to Parliament. I thought all that was handled pretty well. And let's face it, if you're the leader of a European country, dealing with America is almost as great a problem as dealing with, say, Russia. And perhaps we haven't done too badly at that, though of course things can change overnight, as we know in Trump's world. So sorry, Trump is not a passing phase, incidentally. I think after him comes J.D. Vance. That's the
I
who is
agree.
intelligent, whether you like him or not. He is intelligent.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. And I think that really we have to watch this space, because if Trump ends up truncating his term in office, the real fun will be when JD takes over. And that's where things
Well,
get.
yes, and even if Trump serves his full term of office, I think JD must be the leading candidate.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. Look, Pete, the US and Britain are close in terms of understanding technology, sharing technology and techniques for controlling social media, AI, and various other bits and pieces. But obviously, there are also differences between the two countries as well. What can you tell our audience in terms of the whole cyber security, the bilateral security between the US on the one side and the UK on the other, especially since we do have this very real difference in the relationship that matters, the transatlantic relationship. You know, we do have a very tempestuous person sitting in the White House. Has that made things easier for us to navigate through joint cyber AI operations with the Americans, or has that not been touched?
It's interesting. Somebody rang me up who I suppose you could probably say had an intelligence background, who was extremely annoyed about the relationship between the Americans and Canada because they felt that that could potentially impugn some of the intelligence sharing that was going on in. Apparently, there is a recognition that in despite of the bellicose statements by people like Trump, that would be stupid. So they are still sharing some information or sharing information on the same basis. There has been some real inconsistencies in terms of what the US are doing in terms of what they designate a cyber threat. The overall picture is a little incoherent. I just wanted to go to one thing, because you'd mentioned that, the UK's not the power it was. Well, let's think about what power is and what the manifestations of that were. When the UK had this massive navy, we were controlling world trade. Right, 6% of world trade went through Liverpool. Now, what we're in is this new internet world where data is everything. Data is the new economy. 70% of the world's data goes through servers in North Virginia in America. Okay, which is one of the reasons why I brought up this issue about data sovereignty and pointed out that Pat was one of the first people to talk about this. Donald Trump said in February that he was going to make sure that all of the world's data ran on American technology, which is an incredibly important issue, because basically what that means is that if the Americans can look at your data, if they can interpret it, if they can see patterns in it, and they do actually have the capacity to go in the back of all of these big American technology companies, that becomes a huge issue for us. It becomes a huge issue for the world. So what we're going to see is a sovereignty war, a data sovereignty war, because let's face it, GDPR says that certain data should not go outside of Europe. So we're going to have to ensure that this 70% data that is going to the US at the moment doesn't actually happen, and that's against Trump's pronouncements. JD Vance has also said in February, he said at the Munich Security Summit, that we had to abandon all ideas of copyright and ownership of data so that AI could be trained. Now, the reason that they want to do that is because the Americans wish to win the AI war. Putin said about 4 or 5 years ago that whoever wins the AI war wins the world. So where does cyber sit in all of this? The one thing that people don't realize about cyber, the one thing that they don't realize about these movements of data is cyber is the glue that puts everything together. If you've got rubbish data, you get rubbish AI. Okay, so to guarantee that your models, you have to have very good cyber. We don't really seem to have realized that at the moment. In terms of the population at large, we're in an equivalent position to the time Zola wrote Le Bête Humaine, which was about how people didn't understand steam engines and that people could, move from one city to another and commit a murder. If you talk to people about AI systems, they really don't understand what's going on. They don't even understand what's going on with their own data. And we've got this ID card system in the UK, which is apparently going to be the solution to illegal migration, which it's not. However, that does represent an opportunity, because if you actually get the ID card system right and you say, we're going to give you your ID back, we're going to give you distributed data, yeah? And then you're going to start developing the data awareness that is necessary for people to begin to understand what AI is and what cybersecurity is. Once you begin to understand that there is a value in your data, that there is a value in your understanding how it's used and how to protect that using some reasonable cybersecurity, then you're going to begin to understand this new world, and we can start to evolve the understanding of the basics that is necessary for the population at large to go forward. I know that might sound a little complicated, but it's not. One of the things that you can, right, if you distribute the data, then you don't have the huge problems that the government has with cyber attacks. So far, in the last 2 years, the government's lost the entire UK electoral register, which is not very clever. And it's lost 4 defence databases. I haven't got time to go through how many databases we've lost. If you distribute it, you increase the attack surface, right? So lots and lots, you have to be attacked individually. So there's safety in numbers. So that's a good idea. And then if you actually say to people, actually, we'll put in some data audit technology on this that allows you to know when your data is used and where it's used, then you'll begin to understand artificial intelligence, and you'll also begin to understand what the value of your data is. You'll also be able to put in agentic permissions, they're called, but basically where you can say, actually, I don't want my data to be used by the MOD, but I'd actually quite like it to be used by the Department of Health, because that way there could be some new developments that are made with regard to diseases. And is this possible? Yes, it is. I interviewed the chief data architect of Estonia. They've done that. They've actually got buy-in from the entire adult population into working like this. So, I know it's a slightly complex answer, but you have to understand the data. You have to protect the data. Also, there's something that I find fascinating, which is AI needs human data. It's actually vampiric in a sense. If you feed it on synthetic data, it becomes more robotic. People don't like robotic AI because they don't feel that it relates to them, which is one of the other reasons why the people are trying to work on coming up with AI systems that seem to be very human. That then also throws up another huge problem, though, which is that we have to be very, very careful about anthropomorphization with computer systems, because they are systems. They're not human beings. And when people start to call them it's not an it. It's somebody passing an electric current through some materials. Where, and if you want that to be fitted into a defense context, cybersecurity, we can come up with some very, very good cybersecurity, but we have to actually identify what it is that we want to protect and what it is that we want to do. And we haven't been very good at doing that. You can use blockchain technology very effectively to lock down a lot of information and make sure it's only used for what you want it to be used for. That's the key to cybersecurity.
Okay, so gentlemen, defense matters most where the shooting war already is, and here we must turn our attention to Ukraine. Ukraine is grinding through its fourth year of full-scale war. The US is distracted and, under Trump, belligerent and confused against all comers. European unity is overstated. Russia continues to militarily push its advantage. Chris, public fatigue is real. How does Starmer navigate a war that voters increasingly feel is someone else's problem? Do they accept the latest Trump proposal for peace, even though it potentially sells out Zelensky and Ukraine?
Well, I don't think we know what the latest proposal for peace is in any detail. It seems to have changed in the last few days quite dramatically. But I don't think anybody trusts Trump to come up with a just solution, or indeed to resist the Russians. But yes, it's going to go on for a long time, and if we are sticking by Ukraine, it's going to have to be a long-term commitment. The big problem is whether the Americans, I think the resolve will be stronger in Europe for obvious reasons. We're next door. It's America that's beginning to lose interest. So the issue is, can Ukraine defend itself just with European support? Whereas some of the technologies the best technologies are specific to America. They come from America. So who knows? The point made by the Americans a while ago that there's 170 million of us and only 130 million Russians is not a bad one. I mean, Trump's men have been right about one or two things. We have become far too dependent on America, and we need to wean ourselves off that. I do accept that.
Pete, your reporting tracks Russian information operations. Where is Moscow succeeding and where is the UK asleep?
Russia's, I mean, it's difficult to see a coherent plan. I mean, Russia basically uses an extraterritorial system which pulls in organized criminal elements, and a lot of them are very deniable. So you can see in some of the attacks that have gone on against British industry that they're, you could say Marks and Spencers, you could say Jaguar Land Rover, although the attack on Marks and Spencers was British people who were involved in that. But what the Russians tend to do is it's very much a sort of guerrilla campaign. They will make software available to groups like Scattered Spider, for example. They will put materials out into the dark web that people can use. They're very, very good at obfuscation, and they're very good at deniability, because they have a different attack strategy to, say, the Chinese. The Chinese are just ruthlessly after information and are gathering information to stock up against the future. Are the Chinese coherent? The Russians, they're very destabilizing. I mean, one of the things that's actually been ironic about the Ukrainian-Russian conflict was that both the Ukrainians and the Russians were pretty adept at cyber criminality. And the Ukrainians were actually preying on Europe and other parts of the world as much as the Russians were. And with the advent of the hostilities, that the Ukrainians said, actually, we'd better stop attacking other parts of the world because it won't look very good for us. And on some of the dark crime websites and places, the Russians and the Ukrainians were saying, look, can we just forget about the fact that a war's going on? Let's just be good criminals together. It's more that there are these extraterritorials that Russia enjoys sort of using. The crossover between Russian intelligence and Russian organized crime in St. Petersburg, which is the city where apparently Putin is, in mafia terms, is called the roof. I think that's more of the picture. I mean, what is interesting, again, going back to something that we were mentioning at the beginning of this, is that we're getting a lot more visibility now. One of the big problems has been in the past was always deniability. We're beginning to see where stuff is coming from, and we can understand that. That's essentially the picture that's coming from Russia. It is. There is a strategy behind it, but it does tend to, they like to obscure where they're coming from. Because there's another thing that's been going on. I mentioned space earlier. There's Russian jamming of space. There is this geopolitical pinging that is going on to increase tension in space. We've seen this, Pat will be more aware of this than me, of the testing of the undersea cables, etc., etc. The strategy is ping, 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 and then every now and then, you will get some hurt to your infrastructure. And I do think, though, what we need to do is really be a lot more aware of what these infrastructural hits can do. You look at Nortel, for example. I interviewed the head of cyber for Nortel. He said that the Chinese government basically sucked all of their intellectual property out. So Nortel, this billion-dollar company, disappeared, and simultaneously a Chinese company called Huawei emerged, which had got remarkably similar technology to Nortel. So that's the equivalent of somebody bombing a large part of your economy. And nobody did anything about it. There wasn't a response to that saying, you've bombed a large part of our economy and you've stolen it. Which can you imagine a load of bombers from China flying over to Canada and taking out a factory? I mean, the response would have been amazing, but we don't do that in cyber. And so that brings me to Jaguar Land Rover. The government is forced into saying that it could be potentially bailing out Jaguar Land Rover to the tune of 1.5 billion. Well, that's a hit on an economy that's already suffering, as we heard from everybody else on this. That's how you do it. It's a sort of hunting pack slashing at you and biting bits into you until you lose a bit of blood.
Pat, what capabilities does Ukraine actually need now, and what is Britain realistically able to supply?
It depends what your ultimate aim is. If Europe wants to be able to support Ukraine in continuing the war to a more amenable solution than that which looks to be the outcome at the moment, with the huge amounts of resource that Russia can bring to bear. In the absence of the United States, because I think that Donald Trump has got bored with Ukraine. He said that he was going to sort Ukraine out in 24 hours. He hasn't managed to do it. I mean, we might say, well, surprise, surprise, but, so Trump will behave just in the way he's always behaved, which is say, well, I'm not interested any longer in Ukraine. It can go sink. And I'm going to get on with things that are going to make me, quote, United States money. And so there has been a lot of back chat going on between Russia and the United States about, these deals for rare earths and whatever. So if Europe wants to take over, then we have got to enable Ukraine to continue its policy of attacking Russian oil infrastructure, because that's the only reason why Russia can continue to prosecute the war, is because of the money it's earning from its oil. Russia is not a particularly sophisticated country. I can remember when after the wall fell and we started looking back at our view of the Soviet Union, we inflated these capabilities to be way beyond what they were. And as the Russian army showed 4 years ago when it invaded Ukraine, it is piss poor at being able to do the things that we would expect a large European army to do. I mean, it was badly led. It had no credible leadership infrastructure. Its non-commissioned officers have no responsibility. They're not allowed to use their initiative. Officers are not taught to use their initiative. They are taught to obey orders. And if those orders lead to a disaster, you are basically taught to lie, to, tell your boss that you've achieved whatever aim you wanted to achieve. So Russian military is not a good military. It's not an effective military.
Sorry, Pat, but then again, we have this other issue, and that is, I get everything that you say, and I do agree that in terms of conventional warfare, Russia has a long way to go before it can be considered a peer among the European countries. However, in recent months, Britain has accused Russia of cyber intrusions. There's been the GPS spoofing around the North Sea. There's harassment of foreign shipping. As Pete was saying earlier, there's the constant sniping at the undersea cables and disinformation campaigns targeting British institutions. Pat, that shows a degree of sophistication. It may not be what we like. They can't fight a conventional war very well, but they can do this other thing. And to both you and to Pete, I mean, is this the new normal? And if it is, how do we combat it? I mean, there's been some discussion that perhaps the West generally has let Russia run riot without a proper response. I mean, why doesn't the West, or why doesn't Britain specifically, push back when it's been provoked?
Well, I think that you are perhaps ascribing a level of coordination and strategy to Russia that I don't believe exists. I do believe that there are groups within the Russian military who are conducting relatively independent operations and making life difficult. And they're clearly encouraged by President Putin to make life, slightly difficult. So, we have the AGI. We've had AGIs for years. I mean, I can remember when serving in submarines, either trailing AGIs or, being as difficult as possible with AGIs just to make their life difficult.
Excuse me, Pat. What is an AGI for the people out there?
An AGI is an auxiliary ship that is collecting general intelligence.
Thank you.
So the Yantor, which is currently off the north coast of Scotland, which was shining a blue laser at the pilot of the aircraft, that's very typical low-level annoyance. And yes, we are getting more of these. Where I think also, you know how it is when you wake up one morning and think, I've got a pain in my shoulder. everything you do that day involves that pain in your shoulder, and you think it's getting worse. We have suddenly started talking about underwater cables, and suddenly we're thinking, gosh, oh, we leave these cables around the sea floor, and we get surprised when, the Russians take an interest in them. Well, I have to say they've been a strategic issue for many more years than the last two or three. I mean, and some of us have been saying, you do want to look after your underwater cables because they are just out there lying on the seabed and someone could come along and pick them up. What, of course, has changed is the ability to know exactly where the undersea cable is. I mean, if you think back to such famous intelligence things as the Zimmermann letter, the German radio traffic was being read by the British in the First World War, mainly because we took some ships out into the Baltic and trawled the sea bottom so that we could capture the cables. So, this is in 1914. We captured the cables, we intercepted the messages, we got the German codes, and we were reading their signals for most of the First World War. So it's nothing new, and come a more aggressive war, people would be doing the same. And we shouldn't be surprised about it. We should be prepared, but we shouldn't be surprised about it. Now, what are we going to do about it now? Well, that's up to a government to decide. That's a political issue as to what are the rules of engagement. If an AGI captain starts flashing a pilot with a blue laser, you could have a response that says, destroy the ship. Might be considered a bit over the top, and you might want to think carefully before you adopted that particular response. But that is a political response that needs to be taken.
Just wanted to jump in on that, John, because
all right.
One of the points that people don't get about these undersea cables is where they go from. Okay, Ireland, right? The cables across the Atlantic go from Ireland. Where do they come up? They come up in North Virginia, which is where all of these data centers are in the America that are taking 70% of the world's data traffic. Okay, now Pat makes the point very well that we just sit there and we think, we'll put these great big these cables. Okay, they're tiny in comparison to the Atlantic. And the fact that there's one going over the Marinara Trench, I actually find that it is quite an evocative thought. So you've got these things. Nobody's protecting them. One of the other things that people don't realize is that you can actually put bits of technology onto those cables and it monitors everything that's going through them. Whether you can actually make any use of that data or not, I don't know, but you can actually put something on that monitors the cable and the traffic through it from the outside, and that has been done very many times. So in terms of a vulnerability, we're just not thinking about this new world that we're in and what it actually means. Because again, as I've said, we're thinking about a 20th century world. And if you think about drone technology and drone technology's capability to get very deep down into, we use drones to actually look at the wreck of the Titanic, the Hood, the Bismarck, etc., etc. We can go to places that we've never gone to before. One of the things that I actually loved was that there is a company called Saildrone. It was a British company. It's now an American company. And Saildrone goes to places where you can't actually put ships. And it uses solar panels and sails to get to the most amazing places and map the seabed. So that's where the 21st century is. And then, as Pat says, we have these incredible strategic assets which are utterly unprotected.
Gentlemen, would you excuse me? I have to go now.
Oh,
So I'm going to ride off into a sunset. A pleasure serving with you. Thank you for having
thank
me
you.
on.
Thanks very much, Chris. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. Cheers, Chris.
Thank you. Bye. All right. Well, look, just getting back into what Pete said, are there any rules of engagement for cyber?
Actually, in fact, that was another point I wanted to make too. No, there aren't. And
Mm,
that's when, so one of the things about this is, you know, I mean, Pat and I haven't mentioned that, you know, for example, you could let off some nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. Three of them would take out the entire infrastructure of the US.
wow.
All of the power would go down, all of the communication systems would go down. That's it. End of. That's mutually assured destruction. You can do the same in any other part. And even if you did that in the US, over the US, there was no guarantee that it would just be the US that would be affected. You could affect other parts of, you know, Europe, perhaps, potentially. So, in a sense, what we need to do, because if you amplify that out into cybersecurity, if you take the NotPetya attack, the NotPetya attack was intended to take out part of the Ukrainian power supply. And going to Pat's point about dropping carbon fiber on the substations, it then, unfortunately, because it wasn't properly targeted, because these things are very difficult to target, it also took out part of the wind turbine network. And then it nearly demolished the Maersk shipping line. And the Maersk shipping line was hours away from total and utter collapse, which would have meant that all of these ships were left all over the place, and supplies and world traffic was completely to use a technical naval term, buggered. So that's what we're looking at. So do we almost need an agreement where we say, actually, we're not going to do that, because there's some other things that sit underneath all of this as well, which is there's an incredibly complex technology infrastructure. It's incredibly vulnerable because it's actually rubbish, right? We've built everything on rubbish. It's like Rome to the power of 1,000, and so it could go down at any time. We could have a catastrophic wipeout. And so you're then adding into that the fact that you've got people deliberately trying to mess up the entire thing. That's very, very, very dangerous for everybody. It's not particularly responsible or intelligent. We need to actually overhaul the entire system. So in the UK government saying, okay, we're going to make everything resilient because we're going to build cybersecurity onto a system that is already so complex that it could fall over at any minute is just a bit strange. So I think that we have to start being enormously grown up about all of this. Again, it goes back to that point of satellites going and trying to intimidate each other in this sort of geopolitical sense. We are all dependent on these systems. And if they go down, the damage could be absolutely cataclysmic. And then you add it into that, one of the most sublime pieces of intelligence that humanity has ever come up with, AI. So you actually factor even more complexity into all of that. And so the opportunity for a car crash or a motorway pileup of the sort that you've never ever seen in your life is there. And then we did an interview. We did a radio program, which on the face of it, we thought, well, it's Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So we'll do a program. We'll be public spirited about this. And we went and interviewed these people, and it was shocking. It was absolutely terrifying. We were told that these pig butchering gangs in Southeast Asia are using AI to come up with identification for victims that is going to start a tsunami of cybercrime. And all of the intelligence agencies and the people involved in cyber are terrified about this, because the wave of crime, and it's going to be aimed at small and medium-sized businesses and business people, because those are the ones that you want to exploit. They were saying that that is a real threat to the economy, not because of people actually robbing those people, even though that's going to be an issue, but because, to go to Pat's point about psychology, you're going to get people worried to death about being hit by this thing and where it's coming from. That's also going to create sort of hacking in a way that will cause some instability within the networks. You've also got other allied developments, which are AI deepfakes. We interviewed this woman from London University, the UCL, who's one of the world's leading experts on audio. And she says that deepfakes are now perfect. Audio deepfakes are perfect. So I could deepfake myself, ring Pat up, and Pat would say, "That's Peter Warren. I know that's Peter Warren. It's got his mannerisms and so on and so on and so on." So that the dangers from all of this are so great that, in a sense, we need to bang our heads together. The United Nations needs to get involved as well, because it's a very, very dangerous situation. Well, some group, but John needs to get involved. Sorry.
Well, I mean, if you look at Elon Musk's activities in terms of Starlink, the number of Peter was talking about activities of satellites up in orbit. If you look at near Earth orbit and look at the number of satellites that were up there, say 10 years ago, it was probably about 1,000. Now there are something like 12,000.
No, Pat, 30,000.
30,000. And in 10 years' time, there are going to be 100,000. Now, suddenly, you are going to find, we already have, there are already people working very hard to make sure that there are no collisions with all the space debris that there is up there. But there's going to come a point in time at which it becomes so crowded, you cannot avoid these things happening. It's going to be a bit like, Peter was talking about the M25. It's going to be a bit like having the M25 with no highway code rules whatsoever. You can drive on whatever side of the road you like. You can go in whichever direction you like. You can, and that's what it's going to be like up in near Earth orbit. And that is going to cause mayhem, because everything is dependent upon what goes on in that relatively small part of space. And it's all going to get pretty complicated.
Gentlemen, I'm going to start moving us toward a conclusion. It's been a fascinating discussion, but let me close with a couple of insights on where you think Nigel Farage's Reform Party is situating itself. They're not forming government yet, but they are shaping the narrative, especially on touchstone issues like immigration and economic sovereignty and crime. Pete, Reform's messaging is brutal, it's simple, and it's digital. Why is it resonating? What makes their digital strategy so compelling?
Social media. If you actually look at this, we've commented on this a lot here at the Future Intelligence Password and Tech TV. The growth of these extremist parties has occurred directly in inverse proportions to social media. You can essentially group yourself with other people. You can actually start making the noise that you want. One of the things that is noticeable, if you actually go onto social media and as I do, and manifesting the opinions that I do, you can see people coming in packs to actually attack you. It's not that they're necessarily highly organized, but they are groups of people who share opinions, and they come in. And so you're getting an amplification factor that is disproportionate to the amount of people. That's one of the reasons that I think that you're getting this with Farage. I mean, I have been trying to get a campaign together for something. It's basically on LinkedIn, lots and lots of people have been complaining that they're not getting jobs any longer because they're over 47. So I'd said, why don't you all get together and do something about it? Because you've all got a significant vote. You're a significant demographic, and you've also got loads of money. You can quite easily put some pressure on politically if you get yourself organised. Only a few people followed up, which I thought was quite interesting. And that's the point that I'm making, is that if you get people who are actually quite highly organized and quite motivated, then you can actually do that. The amplification that you're getting from Nigel Farage, you're seeing that in opinion polls. Whether you'll actually see that manifested at an election where people do traditionally tend to fall back onto particular positions would be interesting. And the other point about the reform is defining itself with negatives. The big test will be policies. The big test would be getting reform. I mean, for people in the armed services to start to take reform seriously at particular levels, I would find that very, very interesting, because they would have to, those people would have to be convinced that reform had some sort of strategy and some sort of intellectual forethought or plan. That, I think, will be another test of reform. From what we've seen in the performance in places like Kent County Council, it hasn't looked very, very good at the moment. So I think that those are the defining things. It's down to, do they have a coherent policy? Do they have a coherent economic policy? Do they have a coherent strategic future policy? And I can't quite see that at the moment.
Just on that, Pat, how would a reform-style foreign and defence policy reshape Britain?
You can't have a security and defence policy absent from a general view of where you want your world to go, where you want, the United Kingdom to go, for example. And I don't think that they have refined their view on where the United Kingdom should stand. I agree with Peter. I think that reform is essentially a protest vote. It is saying to people, there are lots of things you don't like about the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, or even about general traditional politics over the last 30 years. It's all been awful. We're here. We're going to solve it. And of course, people go, wow, oh, that's nice. But of course, as Peter says, in Kent, and of course down here in Cornwall, where I live, where we've got a quite large reform group, it seems to have got rid of its leader, and it's got rid of various other members of the Reform Party because they're falling out with each other. I mean, they are just unable to make the connection between social media announcements and actually delivering something that the electorate want.
Sort of like what we're seeing right now in the United States in MAGA, and how elements within MAGA are starting to peel away and starting to demonstrate a sort of normalcy. Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance, starting to talk common sense. She's left MAGA in the window. Go figure.
I mean, I think it is, where the rubber hits the road, that reform will sink or swim. and I suspect most likely sink. And this will be seen, and until they become mature enough to develop proper policies that people can agree with or can be involved in developing, we'll find that, yes, people will say, well, I think reform are great, but they will not become a government from a national point of view.
So, what does reform stand for in terms of how it sees Britain in the world? Does it have a coherent foreign policy? Does it have like a MAGA policy where it's Britain first, or however you want to call it? Or
No.
and what's the military position? Does it have one?
No, I mean, I think that reform harks back to an age that never actually existed. I mean, if you were really to try to pinpoint a decade, it's probably harking back to the 60s or even the 50s. But actually, for those of us who lived through the 50s and 60s, they weren't the great, fantastic, sort of romantic type decades. It was pretty grim. And, to want to go back to that is seemingly asinine. And, there's this view of, every morning the bugle was played and and Britain woke up and hoisted the Union flag to the top of the flagpole. It wasn't like that, and and going and trying to develop that as an image is not something that I'd want to see again.
I think they want to go back even further, Pat. I think they want to go back to the Spithead Review and to Binia, showing that it could outpace all of these other ships. Yeah, John, I actually think reform tries to define itself by negatives. It defines itself by stuff that it thinks is wrong rather than coming up with any solutions. One of the things that I think that is very interesting, you can have some analogies with MAGA, and those are that Trump tries to say that he's going to rebuild the Rust Belt and he's going to bring back all of these jobs. They were crappy jobs. They were horrible factory jobs, and nobody would particularly want them. And a lot of the areas where reform is actually having some impact are industrially they're deprived areas. Now that then goes back to the point of, okay, we've got to develop an ongoing and decent economy. And people would say, oh, you're not going to be able to do that. Well, I'd actually say, hang on a moment, look at Manchester. Manchester in the UK is now a massive success story because the GDP in Manchester is 3 times that of London now. And it's really, really going. Why is it going? Because they've embraced technology, because they're developing new high-tech infrastructure. One of the things about all of this is the data centers that people have been talking about in terms of an AI infrastructure. Data centers, they don't employ a lot of people, but they are good things because a lot of businesses actually start up around data centers because data centers start to attract other businesses. The reason that they attract other businesses is because you can do a lot of things locally. You don't actually need to move in information to these centralized locations. That's one of the big discoveries that people have been promoting in technology and in AI, that you can actually, I'll give you an incredibly good example. We do a TV program here, and to actually achieve the highest resolutions possible to go into the virtual studio, we move the data locally on the Wi-Fi network that is in the office, and we get very, very high resolution as a result of that. Yeah, so we're not moving the data right the way to the to wherever Zoom servers are. We're doing it here. And that's one of the lessons that, again, we need to learn about technology. We need to know how it works. The only reason that we have done what we've done is because the guy who helps me, or who my partner with the technology, is he's a former Royal Naval weapons engineer who knows all about technology. One final point that I think we should make too, which is, we need to get this this workforce going, and we need to get this knowledge of technology going. Rishi Sunak, I think, had a good idea when he suggested that people should become involved in the territorial army. I think that if the army the armed forces went back to offering these sorts of apprenticeships where you actually learnt about technology, it would actually be a really good idea, because you would then get, there is a 80% shortfall in cyber in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same in Australia, although Australia is doing some incredibly good things with technology. But if you want to pick up that shortfall, you get people who are coming out of universities here or who've done cyber courses. They can't get a job because they don't have the experience. If you put them into a territorial army cyber division, then you could get them the experience. They could go straight into industry, and that would be a good thing. We could do the same with AI. I think that is one of the ways that we could actually achieve these sort of these discrepancies that we have. But there you go.
Well, anyway, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Now, on to my final thoughts. As Britain heads into 2026, the country faces a test of resilience: economic, military, political, and cultural. Yet tonight shows there is no shortage of people willing to diagnose, debate, and demand better. Chris Mullin, Commodore Pat Tyrrell, Pete Warren, it's been an honour finishing the year with you. To our audience, thank you for an extraordinary year of The Focus. We'll be back in 2026 with more clarity, more analysis, and more hard questions. Until then, enjoy your Christmas, New Year's holiday. Stay safe, stay curious, and stay focused. I'm John Bruni, and from Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.